Hello everybody, thanks for joining me again. Today we're going to be taking a look at making a bass line for Forest's Eye. Okay, so I'll just play a clip so you can hear the bass we're going to sort of clone. Bear in mind though, this isn't necessarily, the be-all and end-all of how to make bass for Forest. It's a basis for you to take and tweak and work on so you can make something that you like. Okay, so just so you can hear it on its own, it sounds like this. That sort of almost VB1-like texture. Okay, so let's get to it. New MIDI channel, we're going to get Serum. Okay, and what we're going to do is we're going to make a waveform specifically for this type of bass. So if you're familiar with VB1, then you'll know it has this kind of raspy texture to it, and if you don't know VB1, go and check it out. You'll notice that a heck of a lot of tunes are using VB1, especially the older stuff, and it has a very, very specific character about it, kind of this buzzy, transient. Okay, so the way we're going to copy that is we're going to go into the wavetable editor, we're going to duplicate this on the first one, we're going to flip vertical or horizontal, doesn't matter, it's the same thing in this instance because of its pure saw. And then what we need to do is just set this down to 2 and go left one. So we just have the ramp down saw, and then in our other waveform, what we need to do is flip this also. But on this one, rather than going 2, we're going to go to 58 and then go left one. Okay, so now we just go morph, crossfade. So we should now have a waveform that goes from ramp down to 180 degrees out. Okay, so this is what we're after, this shape in the middle. I quite like to just normalize them, so process, normalize each gain separately, and then I think it's usually around about 21, 23 on the wavetable position is roughly as close as we're going to get to VB1. Just to check how it looks against the real thing, I have actually got the VB1 saw here. It's pretty close. It's very, very similar. We could just use the VB1 saw, but I quite like being able to control how much VB1-ness we have. Okay, so things to note about doing this to the waveform are we're going to get a slight squarification to the tone of our sound because as we turn this up, we get louder and louder odd harmonics. So we're kind of injecting square into our waveform. Okay, so let's put this back. The other thing is that where we've got this sharp spike happening in the middle, we inject a lot of high frequencies, which is exactly what we want really, because we want to have small filter modulations going on for this type of bass. Also, it gives us this nice raspy texture in the transient, which you might not like, but if you don't like it, you can just turn it off. Anyways, right, so now that we've made the waveform, next step is make sure this is in the right octave. We need it in -1, and let's pop onto here, and we're going to get MIDI region 16ths. I'm going to go with E. Okay, and we're going to make the first note as quiet or as low velocity as possible, and the last 2 notes as high velocity as possible. Okay, and then make sure this is on loop, and just loop this over. I know it's the same MIDI, so I'm just going to copy this over as well, just so it rolls over properly at the end. Then we're going to go into MIDI effects, and I want note length and velocity. Okay, so really depending on your taste and whether you want it to be more of like a sort of more humming rolling bass or whether you want it to be a more plucky kind of staccato bass, this is going to decide your note length. If I wanted a more rolling one, I'd go with a 16th and then maybe 75%. But we're going to do a bit more staccato type of thing, so I'm going to go for about 55 in assistance. Okay, and then let's just put the lowest possible velocity up full. Now let's dive into Serum. Okay, so first thing I'm going to do is just set the phase all the way back at the start and the random all the way down, because I want it to start at the beginning every time. Then I'm going to set the level about 40%. It doesn't really matter what level you use, you just need to make sure you can hear it. And then I'm going to use velocity, maybe about 50 points or so. Then we're going to go for a MG low 12. You can use tighter filters if you like. For the sort of foresty sounding stuff, I find the 12 dB per octave is kind of perfect. Okay, so I'm going to set the resonance about 5-6%. It's really down to taste, the resonance. A lot of the time I just have none, but sometimes sort of between 4 and 6 can sound quite nice. Anyways, let's set this to key tracking, just so that if we want to use this on lots of different keys, it will kind of track it a little bit better. Sometimes it doesn't sound that good, but more often than not, it kind of works. Okay, so let's set the cutoff for our filter. Now, what I'm listening out for is I want to hear a bit of low mid grumble, but I want to hear some definition between the notes still. So let's turn it all the way down and just bring it up until we get to sort of where I think it sounds right. Okay, in assistance, about 360 odd sounded right to me. Now, let's set up our envelopes. Envelope 1, the amp envelope, I'm just going to turn attack all the way down, maybe 5 milliseconds of hold, then 100 milliseconds decay, and maybe about -10, -12 sustain. And then I want this kind of bowed out belly shape going on, sort of curve it upwards. Then I'm going to go with about 35 or so, maybe 30 milliseconds of release, and I kind of just set it to follow the curve, and then I might tweak the actual curve later on once I've done some processing and things to kind of tighten it up. And also the attack, sometimes a little bit of attack can sound really good. Again, I just wait till I've got some of the processing done to fine tune that. I'm just going to turn the pitch bend off as well, because my controller likes to randomly bend things. Okay, so then we're going to get an envelope 2, and we're going to put this on the cutoff. Okay, and I'm going to set the attack to 0, maybe some hold, but let's leave it off for now. 100 milliseconds of decay, no sustain, and we'll set the release to be the same. Sometimes I'll set the filter envelope release a bit longer than the amp envelope, because that can sometimes kind of sound better, I think. But anyways, we want this curve to be perfectly straight, maybe even slightly bowed out. Okay, and then we're going to just set the modulation amount by ear. Let's just hear it on its own. Okay, so we could leave it up here with a bit more of the highs coming through, but I prefer the way the lows are being represented with actually a bit less, and that's what matters more to me at this point. Okay, so around 20 was sounding kind of about right to me. So now let's go to the effects section. We need EQ and a filter. I quite like setting the high 18 or high 24 pretty much right down as low as it'll go, sometimes with a little bit of resonance. And we'll look at the oscilloscope so you can kind of see why. So with these forest spaces, I'm trying to get the waveform to be quite asymmetrical, because I tend to find that for the more hummy basses that work in kind of the Nightfall on stuff, having them be symmetrical, the waveform works really nicely. But for this forest stuff, to get each bass hit to kind of really jump out of the speaker, it being asymmetrical seems to have a really nice effect. So let's have a look at the waveform. And then with the filter. Okay, so it's pushing the waveform up into the positive phase. Alright, so let's say we're happy with that. The other thing to note as well is doing this it's going to push the lows literally further in time away from the start of the note. So you'll notice the very first cycle gets a bit smaller, and so it makes the very beginning of the note literally have less bass going on, and this kind of big belly going on here, which gives each note a kind of beating, thumping type of thing going on. Right, so next thing we're going to do is we're going to use the EQ, and pretty much I want to pull out some stuff at 500 hertz. It's almost always at 500 hertz for these basses. This is the stuff I don't like. 500 hertz. Let's go with a Q of about 55, and let's take 5 dB. Also, we want to set it to the little peak notch thing rather than a shelf or a cut. Okay, so let's hear what difference that makes. Okay, so to me that sounds much cleaner. Okay, now so I'm going to take a shelf, a high shelf, and I'll set it to about 800 hertz, or between 600 and 1000 hertz, but I think 800 is probably going to be fine, because we now want to kind of push the higher stuff and get the high mids, sort of 1K area. I want to get those high mids a bit louder and get that kind of raspy quality coming out a bit better and balance our bass note a bit more. Okay, so let's just leave this about 60, and then gain wise, you can just push this manually like this. But often I get clicking when I do it like this, so what I quite like to do is use envelope 1 on the gain, and then just tweak it to taste. Okay, let's say we're happy with that. It's really a personal thing how much highs you want in this, so do whatever you like. So now we have this, and it sits in our mix like this. Okay, it's already got pretty much the right kind of character that we want. But now we're going to have a look at some processing. Okay, so first thing I'm going to do is get utility, and I'm just going to set this so we're hitting around -12. So because it's quite an asymmetrical bass, it's naturally going to be a higher peak level, so it will have less loudness, but loudness isn't necessarily everything. You know, a bit of dynamics can sound really nice too. So let's set this to about -11 then. Okay, so yeah, I usually aim for -12, but for the more asymmetrical bass, -11 is fine. Or really just go by ear and you'll be fine. Okay, so then what I'm going to do is I'm going to get Saturn. And really, you can use any multiband plugin that you like. It doesn't really matter. We're just trying to shape the waveform, and a little bit of distortion can be really nice too. Okay, so I'm just going to leave this warm tape on because I've decided I kind of like it. Let's put in a crossover, and let's solo our kick and bass and have a look at what's actually going on with the waveform. So I'm just going to press play and bring the crossover frequency down. Okay, so you can probably hear, as we sweep this around, it changes the character and the tone of the bass quite considerably. So, unlike sort of full-on and stuff, where we want to use lots of crossovers or dispersion, whatever, around the transient to get those big fat transients, I actually like, in Forest, to leave the transient pretty much alone, not really do much to it, because I find it has more of a kind of knocky niceness to it without screwing with it too much. Okay, so if we bring this crossover right down really low, we get quite a symmetrical waveform, and it gets very kind of humming, rolling type of thing, which can be really nice, and sounds like this, by the way. But what's going on here is, as we move the crossover around, different frequencies are being kind of pushed along in time, and it causes certain frequencies to get emphasized in the lows. So the sort of area I want to emphasize is kind of the second, third harmonic, not the fundamental. So I want to pull this up, maybe have it around 100 hertz area, something like that, but go by ear. So yeah, I mean, this is really personal choice where you want to have it and what you think sounds good. But I want to have quite a sort of nimble bass, if that makes sense. I want it to be kind of popping out the speakers nicely rather than just like a deep, dark hum. Okay, so somewhere around here I think is where I like it. So yeah, as I move it around, you can really hear certain harmonics getting emphasized. Okay, so let's say we're happy with that for now. Let's just leave the amount of distortion as it is because it kind of sounds nice. If you want to get a bit of control as well over what Saturn's doing here, let's just go over to this mix knob here, and you can kind of dial it into taste. Yeah, so, yet another variable to mess with whilst you're making your bass. I'm just going to leave it up full. Okay, now I'm just going to get our bass back to -11 again. Okay, now we're going to do some EQ. I'm going to use Pro Q. It's my favorite. So usually I end up taking out some kind of 5 to 900 area or 5 to 1K area. Let's just sweep through and see what we think needs to go. Okay, so that stuff I think needs to go. It's not very nice. Let's take a little bit of that away. Okay, so only taken away like nearly 2 dB, but it really clears it up and makes it feel a bit less cramped. And brings a lot of clarity. Okay, so then I think I can hear something around 300 or so. I am on headphones at the moment, so it's probably not the most accurate representation, but I often do end up taking a bit of sort of 300 area out. So let's have a sweep around there. Okay, that sounds a little bit cleaner to me. All right, and then very commonly I will just use a high cut at 5K, roughly 12, or sometimes I'll use like a 6 dB one, but bring it lower. But yeah, this is just to get rid of any like really high buzz that just doesn't need to be there. I don't want that really high stuff because that's gonna fight with my drums. All right, and then I'm gonna push the Q a little bit because I want to give this sort of 3-4K area a bit of a push. Because I quite like not having too much high frequencies in the bass in general, really. Okay, and then depending on the key and the BPM, you're going to want to take some of the fundamental out. And the way I suggest doing that is with either use a low shelf if you want to EQ it, or just do it in the synth and tweak the waveform in the FFT. But let's just, for the sake of using the EQ, just use a low shelf. And let's just say we're happy with that. Honestly, I wouldn't make this type of decision on headphones. I'd usually just trust my speakers for this. But yeah, take that bit with take it all with a pinch of salt, but particularly that. Okay, so let's bring it back up to -11. So before it sounded a little bit kind of dirty, and now it sounds a little bit cleaner. Okay, so you could spend hours doing little bits of EQ and distortion and stuff like that, but we're not going to do that. That's up to you. Okay, so I would usually do this earlier, but I totally forgot to do it. Let's turn the minimum velocity down so we get a bit of a bounce going on. really, this is just totally up to you. The higher the value you use here, higher the energy, I suppose, is probably going to be in your track. Kind of a more machine gunny, full power bass line when you have this up all the way. And when you have it all the way down, you can have the more kind of galloping bass line. Okay, so let's leave that at 90. And for a long time, I didn't like doing any sort of sidechainy type stuff. But recently I've decided I quite like to use a little bit of LFO tool. So let's just go to the note retrigger. Also, let's make this a bit bigger. Okay, on the note retrigger, I'm going to click this twice until it says envelope, because we're going to feed this MIDI so it's always perfectly in time. And let's quickly pop to our kick drum instrument. And basically what you want to do is our kick drum sampler. You want to make an instrument rack with it, like here, like I have done here. Then go into the chains, create a new chain. On that chain, we just want the external instrument. Okay, and then MIDI 2. And then you need to select the channel that is your bass. So in this case, 13 Serum. And then choose LFO tool. So now our LFO tool should be triggered by the kick drum, so it never goes out of time. Or, we don't have to mess with this phase option. Okay, and then usually I will just make the first part kind of silent and make sure, or I like to make sure the last two notes aren't affected at all. And then just a little bit of ducking going on for this one. But not just ducking the entire note, because we can do that with the velocity, but actually just kind of curving off the beginning of it a little bit. I just find it gives this tiny bit of movement to the kick and bass, which sounds quite good. If you like, you can just have it go all the way like that and then play with this volume knob here. Let's say we're happy with that. Okay, and then also I'll often just bring this back a little tiny bit, just so that we don't get a little click at the end. Alright, so like I said, you can go and do whatever processing you like to it now, and tweak it to your heart's content. But some things I definitely would at least try are to go back into the patch in Serum, play with this release on the amp envelope, just play with the curve on that, and potentially the length, but definitely play with the curve. Sometimes it can really improve the definition between notes in the lows, but really it depends on the key, BPM, etc, etc. But do give it a go. Also, something I would play around with is pop into the matrix and just go over to your envelope 2, or whatever envelope you decided to use for the filter, and just play with the curve here. So we can get it to be like more or less buzzy if we want. I'll just show you what that sounds like. Okay, so sometimes just taking away sort of a tiny bit, or adding up to -5 or up to +5, whatever, can just give it that subtle tiny little bit it needs to fit better in your track. Cool. That's pretty much it, but one final thing before I go. So let's say you've got a particular bass wave that you really like to use, but you also like this VB1-like effect. So what we can do is just actually grab any waveform. So let's quickly just copy oscillator A to B with mods, and then on oscillator B, just pick any waveform you like to use for bass. I'm just going to take this one, this particular wave. Right, so once you've got your waveform that you like to use, let's go into the waveform editor, duplicate it, and on this second one, on the duplicate, go into singles, squarify. Okay, and then set this back to 58. I should note as well, this bit where you shift it by a 58th is only necessary if you want to get that slightly asymmetricalness that VB1 has. You don't have to do that bit, but I like that, so I'm going to do that. Okay, so then what we do is we just go morph, crossfade. So now you'll have whatever waveform you like with VB1-ness about it. Which can sometimes have a really interesting effect on the character. Alright, so that's it for today. As always, thanks for watching, and I shall see you next time.